Welcome to Embedded Conversations, the podcast that explores what it takes to embed ideas, innovations and partnerships inside the NHS. I'm Scott McKenzie and I work with NHS leaders, commissioners and life science companies to change patient pathways for the better. This podcast brings those ideas to life through shared stories from people inside the system who talk honestly about what works, what doesn't and what it takes to embed change in the real world. If you're working in, around or with the NHS and you want to understand how change really happens, you're in the right place. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the latest Embedded Conversations. Today, I'm really pleased to be joined by Alison Oliver. Alison is a partner at Sintons LLP, and in my opinion, is one of the leading experts in the UK on healthcare, including partnerships, contracting, and governance. And I've worked with Alison over many years, where she works with NHS organisations, including things like general practice, the primary care networks, neighbourhoods, NHS trusts, and of course GP federations as well, which is how I first met Alison. And what Alison does brilliantly is help people navigate what are increasingly complicated and complex commissioning and provider landscapes. So in her role, she brings a really vital and very practical perspective on what the changes really mean for primary care, for secondary care, and of course for industry partners that might want to support them. So today, whether you're leading a neighbourhood, supporting a primary care network, or you work in pharma and medtech or devices, this conversation is going to bring you insights into what's coming next and what it really means to be ready when those new provider contracts arrive and start to take shape. So Alison, good morning. It's an absolute delight to have you here with me.
Good morning, Scott. Thanks very much for having me.
Oh, no, I think for some of the people that I've kind of talked about and said, oh, a legal person, oh, that'll be interesting. And it's primarily, I think, because most of them don't really come across you in your role. You're kind of in the background unless you're working with the front line. So I think you've got some different insights to bring to the party today. That's what I hope we'll be able to get out of you.
Great, yeah.
So if I start with what's changing, it's like, oh, there's a big long list, isn't it? We're hearing more and more about single and multi-neighbourhood provider contracts. I know we haven't got the contracts yet and we don't quite know when they might arrive, probably the 31st of March if it's the standard timescale. But with what we know now, could you explain kind of what they are, how they fit into the wider shift we're seeing in NHS commissioning, please?
Yes. So the idea of single and multi-neighbourhood provider contracts was first mentioned in the NHS 10-year plan, which was published last July. And as you said, we're still waiting for the details. So I think we'd all hoped that we would have a lot more information at this stage than we currently do. Yeah. But what we have been told from the 10-year plan and some very high-level information following is that single neighbourhood providers will provide enhanced services across neighbourhoods of around 50,000 patients, and multi-neighbourhood providers will deliver care that requires working across several neighbourhoods, such as end-of-life care. Yeah. And the whole idea of the single neighbourhood and multi-neighbourhood working is really a continuation of the general shift that we've both seen, Scott, over a number of years towards primary care services being delivered at greater scale, together with an emphasis on moving more services out of hospitals and into local communities.
I mean, funnily enough, the last podcast recording that I did really reminded me of working with you, because you will remember the very first hospital subcontract that we did before left shift was even a thing with Paul Netts up in Newcastle upon Tyne when we shifted that work out the hospital. Paul was my last guest on the podcast talking about that, and I mentioned him to you to him in that conversation, because it was before it was even in vogue. It was even a thing where we're doing left shift, which was brilliant.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
One of the things that comes up, I think, a lot in my work, from a legal perspective, we hear the term that primary care networks and federations particularly need to be contract ready. What for you are the key steps that they should be taking now in terms of things like their governance, their structure, probably their risk management as well? What are those things?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the key things is because we have been told that the commissioners are likely to be able to commission these services from other providers if primary care isn't able to step up and deliver these services. Then one of the things that PCNs or federations need to do is demonstrating that they have the capability and the expertise to deliver the services. I mean, that's the most basic thing, isn't it, when you're having to kind of competitively bid for something. So they should be able to demonstrate that they're able to mobilise a suitably qualified workforce and have effective clinical governance systems, etc. Another thing is actually something we were chatting about before we started recording the podcast, Scott, and that's about, for PCNs in particular, looking at their geographical configuration, because we've been told that the single neighbourhood provider contracts are intended to cover a geography of around 50,000 patients. PCNs have been, the general range is sort of 30 to 50,000 patients. Now, we have had some smaller and some bigger than that. But PCNs that perhaps aren't in the 50,000 ballpark might have to start looking at whether they need to reconfigure and perhaps have some discussions with the ICB locally around that. And also if they're not, what we've termed geographically sensible. So you'd mentioned when we were chatting earlier about donut PCNs, so a PCN where you have a big hole in the middle and the hole in the middle practices might be part of a different PCN or not in a PCN at all. So when you're looking at the new neighbourhoods as determined by the commissioners, the PCNs as far as possible need to try and align with that. And then another aspect is about just having the right sort of organisational structure. And this is kind of the boring legal bit that I do in the background that nobody really wants to think about. But one of the challenges that we've had for PCNs is that they were contracted on the basis of, rather than a single contract being given to an organisation, it was multiple GP practices being contracted to provide services through the directed enhanced service, which is a variation of their core primary care contract. And that meant that PCNs aren't actually legal structures. They're just informal networks of GP practices who each individually have signed up to the network contract directed enhanced service, under which they are collectively responsible for delivering the services. And that's presented some real challenges for PCNs. So, for example, they don't have a legal entity that can employ staff. There isn't an obvious and easy way of managing risk, which comes with collaborative working. And we have seen some PCNs forming limited companies so that they've got a vehicle to employ PCN workforce rather than the individual practices having to bear that risk. But there are lots of PCNs that don't have that corporate vehicle. Now, my view is that most PCNs should be thinking about that, because if you do have a single neighbourhood contract that isn't commissioned via that DES mechanism, then you're probably looking at having a single NHS standard contract being offered across the whole neighbourhood, which I wouldn't be advising individual GP practices to sign up to. It'd be far better to have a legal corporate structure with its own legal personality and with limited liability for the practices within the network.
And again, I suppose with that latter,
it's probably also worth saying, sorry, carry on.
No, go on.
I was just going to say that just another caveat to that was that in some areas where we have established GP federations,
just where I was going to go,
they might be able to hold those contracts for the neighbourhoods within their region, and perhaps kind of subcontract the delivery to the practices, so that income stream is still preserved for practices. But if there isn't a federation in the area, and there are still quite a lot of areas at kind of multi-neighbourhood level that don't have an established federation company, they should be thinking about doing that as well.
So you've actually answered the question that I was going to pose. This is maybe another great role for the GP federations, particularly where they're up, they're running, they've got experience, they've already holding NHS contracts or subcontracts, as we touched on just prior to this. That could be an absolutely great role particularly for the multi-neighbourhood.
Absolutely. Actually, some of our federation clients are doing now is sort of looking at their constitution and governance structure to see if they need to kind of realign that, review that, and realign it to that new way of working, that kind of neighbourhood way of working. So that's another thing. If there, if you are an existing federation and you've been used to working in a particular way, you might want to have a bit of a refresh of your constitution just to see if it needs to be kind of rethought a little bit to make it more appropriate for this new way of working.
It's interesting, this conversation. I'm smiling there just now because I'm literally getting approached again. Scott, could you help us put together a GP federation? I've even got a couple of areas where they had them, folded them, and then I want to restart them again for the very reason that we're talking about. So yeah, that could be another one of those interesting developments ahead. And that kind of leads neatly into the next question that I've got for you, which is, I find really that bit that we're just talking about just now, which I would badge as governance, making sure the decision making is transparent, it's representative of the member practices, and of course it's legally sound. What does that good governance look like in practice, and how do the PCNs and the federations and ultimately neighbourhoods build structures that commissioners would trust?
Yeah, so this is really important because it's something that commissioners need to satisfy themselves about. They want to make sure that, particularly if they're looking for organisations that are representative of the practices within that locality. So there are various accepted pillars of good governance, and so they should be governance structures should be participatory, transparent, as you said, accountable, responsive, efficient, and follow the rule of law. So in practice, participatory governance essentially means ensuring that members are informed and have a voice, and that members and stakeholders are able to access benefits in a fair way. Unfortunately, we do come across PCNs and federations where the leadership team works in a silo and the members aren't engaged or aware of what the organisation is doing. I've even had practices coming to me and saying we need to form a company for our area, and they've actually already got one. But the leadership of that organisation is so detached from them that they don't really understand what they're doing or why, or feel that they have any stake in that organisation. So that kind of engagement is really, really crucial. And that means kind of sharing information, ensuring that the members and other stakeholders are given the opportunity to make their views heard. And that really needs to be baked into the constitution of the organisation, but also lived in practice. It's not enough to just write it down on a bit of paper.
That's it. So again, it's a great point you make, because again, I learned from you way back at the beginning, and it was one of the things that I tried to engender into the boards of the federations that I work with and support, and still do to this day. And I've got some where we have quarterly membership meetings, and the membership are asked, is there anything specific that you want to know about? Is there an update? Is you drive the agenda. We've got things that we want to bring to you, but we absolutely want to engage you in the agenda setting. So they're really well attended because people know this is where I get a chance to have a say. This is where I get an update. I'll then know exactly what's going on. So all of that is part of, for me, good governance and running a federation. But as I say, that was really the learning at the beginning. What you don't want is a siloed board where people don't actually know what the board is working on.
No, absolutely. Really, and it links to the principle of transparency as well. So decision making needs to be open and visible, and leaders should be accountable for their actions.
Totally. Because
and ultimately, the membership should be able to challenge and even replace the leadership if they
I raise that all the time. All the time.
Yeah.
It's in the shareholders. It's not a gift, but it's enshrined in company law that if you want to, you can raise the issues with the board and you can challenge them. But it's part of what being a shareholder is all about. You don't want that happening all the time, but if you really thought the board was behaving inappropriately, there is a mechanism there, but most people don't have an awareness of that.
Exactly. And just coming back to the point about good governance, I mean, I think one of the things that often gets overlooked as well is efficiency. So, we're working in the healthcare system with a very limited budget, and it's really important that resources are utilised responsibly, and that risk is managed effectively so that you don't get wastage of that very precious health resource. And finally, following the rule of law,
Yes.
another principle of good governance. It basically means that systems should be clear and fair and applied equitably. So there's kind of a thread running through all of this around transparency, fairness, openness, transparency.
Yeah. And that really needs to be the case, because as federations and PCNs, potentially PCNs, and again, you've just flagged, I really wouldn't want a PCN signing up to that. I'd want them to have a legal entity for all the reasons that you've given. But as they start holding those larger, more complex contracts, there can be quite significant legal risks that they need to be aware of. I would say things like 2P, so the transfer under protected employment, indemnity is a huge one, data protection, cyber security, things like that. How do they manage those risks effectively from your perspective, but still be able to be agile and to respond to the opportunities?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, I mean, health services are very human resource intensive.
Yeah.
And so some of the main risks for providers working at scale are workforce related, particularly if you're kind of sharing staff for different organisations and so on. So, I mean, employment law is such a complex area. I'm not an employment lawyer. And the penalties for failing to adhere to employment law could be quite high, and it can be quite costly, both in financial terms, but also in kind of just organisational stress. If you do have if you don't manage your employment arrangements well. So it's really important to make sure that you are informed and take the right advice at the right time when you're dealing with workforce issues. You mentioned 2P, yes, and that's a major concern when there are changes in service provision, which is quite often what happens when you have these large, more complex contracts. You might have a lead provider subcontracting services to another provider, and then that ends and it changes to another provider. And every time there's a service contract change like that, 2P will often operate to transfer the workforce engaged by the outgoing provider to the new provider. And the way that 2P works is that all the historic liabilities transfer with the staff. So you really need that contractual protection from the outgoing provider, so that they indemnify the new provider against those historic employment liabilities. And there are also penalties under 2P if that 2P requires that the employers inform and consult with staff when there are going to be changes in their employment, and there are quite onerous penalties for failing to adhere to those obligations. In terms of other risks, you mentioned data protection, and data sharing is a massive risk when you're working collaboratively. You've got, most providers of healthcare will control sensitive personal data about their patients, and then as part of their collaborative working arrangements may well need to share that with other providers. So if you have a provider like a GP practice, they share patient data with a third-party subcontractor, and that third party commits a data breach, the practice could be exposed to claims by patients or regulatory sanctions or action for breach of their NHS contract. And that's not to mention the reputational damage and things like increase in injuries. So it's really, really, really important that when you're, if you are going to share data with another provider, that you carry out due diligence on those third parties to ensure that they've got proper data protection measures in place. And you should always have a data sharing agreement, which sets out clearly how the data can be used and then the responsibilities of all these in relation to that data. And crucially, having some remedies in there for the controller if the other parties commit a data breach.
Oh, it makes me wince just thinking about what that's like if there's a data breach.
It's horrific.
It is. It really is. It's one of those things where you have to. I think it's not. A lot of people say, "Oh, hope we never need that." No, I work the other way around. We want to make sure that this is how we work, so that we never need it. You can't just sit there and hope. It really needs to be part of the system and process that you put in place, which I think is really what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Of course, alongside all of that, we've got the industry, so pharmaceutical, medical technology and device companies who all want to collaborate with the NHS, particularly more and more around pathway redesign, things like diagnostics, the left shift, the community-based services. If I ask you there from a kind of legal standpoint, what makes these partnerships safe, transparent, sustainable, really within those kind of governance frameworks that you've just touched on?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, these kinds of collaboration are becoming more and more common, as you know, Scott, and they can be a really great way of developing innovative and integrated solutions that improve outcomes for patients. So they can be really important part of the overall healthcare landscape. But there are challenges when you have collaborations between different organizations, particularly when they might be working in completely different sectors and they're subject to different regulatory regimes. And as we've just been talking about, data sharing, is obviously one thing that needs to be thought about when you're having that kind of collaboration, but also intellectual property management. That needs really careful planning and good governance. The intellectual property that's developed as part of a collaboration. How do you license it between different collaborators? Shared goals. I think it's really important that everybody knows exactly what they're collaborating for and why. Communicate effectively with each other, and really crucially have clarity about the scope of their respective roles and authority in relation to the collaboration. And again, I'm going to talk about the boring legal stuff, the documents that you hope you never have to read, but you really do need some kind of collaboration agreement, so that you're setting out exactly what the roles of the parties are, what their respective rights are, what their respective responsibilities are, how you're going to share risk and benefit, because this is really fertile ground for disputes.
Yes, and that's what you don't want. It's one of the things that I really enjoy about working with you. You say it's the boring legal bits. I tend to look at it as, no, that's going to be the system and process that we live by. Because if you embed it as the way that you work, there's much less risk of it going wrong. What I tend to find that goes wrong is when we get all the documents done and we kind of go, we'll sign them off, right, put them on the shelf, and then now we're going to go and do our own thing. That's where it tends to go wrong. Whereas if you're very open, transparent, and you embed a system and process in the way that you work that reflects the governance that you've just signed off on, you tend not to have problems. Would that be your experience as well?
Absolutely, yeah.
Cool. That's good.
I mean, it certainly helps.
It does. Yeah, it does. I'm going to ask you to do a bit of crystal ball gazing. If we look ahead, and I get, crikey, every week there's a new document, there's a new policy, there's something else. But if we look at the way that the NHS is evolving, kind of regionally, contractually, maybe some might say culturally, what do you think this landscape is going to look like by the time we get to the end of this Parliament, 29-30? And will we still have PCNs and federations? Will they have a role to play? What would you be advising them to do that will keep them ahead of the curve?
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, in the time that I've worked in this kind of role, I mean, about 20 years, the NHS has changed so much. So we've had, primary care trusts, and then they were replaced with clinical commissioning groups, and then they were replaced with integrated care boards covering much larger areas. And a lot of this is about increased scale. So, I mean, particularly when you're looking at the ICBs compared to the CCGs, but also in the size of the providers. So if you're looking at GP practices, formation of federations when we were working together first, Scott, and then the introduction of PCNs, a lot of the changes in this period have been about increased scale. Also about collaboration that we've talked about. So it's about working with other parts of the healthcare system more effectively. And that's been a theme of a lot of the policy output that we've seen over recent years. And then the direction of 10-year plan is again a much greater focus on moving services into the community, the introduction of neighbourhood and multi-neighbourhood contracts to support that. And in terms of the role of PCNs and federations, well, they obviously have a really good opportunity to occupy that space. PCNs generally align with the neighbourhoods, although as we talked about before, they probably are going to need to be a bit of reconfiguration, but they're in a good place. Federations working at that multi-neighbourhood level obviously have a good opportunity to compete to hold those multi-neighbourhood contracts. But I think one of the main problems with primary care generally at all levels, whether it's at practice, PCN or federation level, is that primary care often does lack the infrastructure and leadership to plan ahead. And there's a risk in that environment that other providers will take those opportunities if general practice doesn't step up. And I do know it's hard, because they're much smaller organisations, but it's in terms of what they can be doing to prepare. Well, I mean, it's very difficult because primary care is going to be dependent a lot of the time on other parts of the system. For example, if you're looking at neighbourhood health centres, most GP practices aren't in a position to build a neighbourhood health centre, so they are going to have to be kind of looking at other, working with other parts of the system to make sure that they can address things like estate. But in terms of what they can be doing themselves, as I mentioned earlier, getting a legal structure, getting your own house in order, making sure that your constitution is correct, is the correct type of constitution for what you want to be doing going forward. They're all good first steps.
Yes. And it was one of the key things I took away from you, because I remember I've been the same 20 years as you. It's kind of ironic, but that's literally the case. So the right back at the beginning, it was PCTs and practice-based commissioning groups. And then as we moved into clinical commissioning groups, we had the development of GP federations, which was really where I first met you, was looking at how I could help people structure that governance and decision making and engagement and such like. And then we rolled that forward into really the end of CCGs and the development of primary care networks, which now sit with ICBs, and we're now going to see neighbourhood teams. And all the way through that, those at-scale GP federation providers have continued. Some have been thrived. Some of them, of course, have come and gone. So I think you're absolutely spot on. I think there is a great opportunity here for general practice, but it needs to be able to step up, and it's got to be able to do it coherently. You can't have 100 different voices. You can't even have 2 different voices. You're going to have one very coherent, structured voice, or I fear you will be absolutely right, someone else will fill the void.
And it's and a lot of it is about mindset, isn't it, Scott? Because I think a lot of practices, because they have such a big workload, it's difficult to be outward looking. And the introduction of primary care networks was a clear statement of intent by NHS England to try and encourage, shall I say, inverted commas, that collaborative working. And I think primary care networks have, to some extent, helped to achieve that. But it is about having that collaborative mindset a lot of the time, which can be difficult when your day job is so hard.
I think a lot of it, I've observed this for many years with the federations and now with the networks. It's the willingness of the individual practice to kind of let go a little bit of the autonomy and the decision making to that at scale organisation, and being prepared to follow rather than challenge everything that comes back the other way. It's that would be my observation. It's just that you've got to let go a little bit of your autonomy and your decision making in return for hopefully a much better outcome.
Yeah.
I've got one last quick question for you. If I could give you a magic wand, and there was one aspect of NHS contracting overnight that we could change, what would it be, and why would that be your choice?
I think it's a really good question, and a bit of a mean one.
Is that a mean one? Sorry, I didn't mean it to be mean.
I do think that the whole system is very complicated.
It is, yeah.
And quite confusing for patients. You have multiple different providers all contracted in different ways, and the system doesn't really, different parts of the system don't really talk together or to each other as much as they need to. I can remember when I was pregnant, having to carry my bits of my maternity record around with me in a scruffy plastic paper folder, and I'm not sure, I mean, although we're not working with those bits of paper so much anymore, I'm not sure that we're that much far advanced in terms of how different parts of the system talk to each other. And that's a bit unkind, because I think it has improved.
It's improved, but I think there are still gaps.
But I do think as a patient, I'm somebody who works within the system and has an understanding of the contracting mechanisms, and still myself as a patient, I'm sometimes a bit confused about who I should be talking to about what, if I'm talking about my own personal health. So I do sometimes think how much simpler it would be if everything was done under the umbrella of a single NHS organisation, without the need for multiple patient records and complex procurement and contracting arrangements between different parts of the system. But that's my head in the clouds, and
that
back
could
in the
be a
real
conversation
world,
for a different day.
Yeah,
we could just about do that, because it is a great point that you make. That so I remember, again, going back to some of the subcontracting things, where, not that we forgot about the patient, don't take it that way, anybody listening, it was never that. It was very, very, the whole point of the redesign was patient focused. But I'm not going to name names, I'm not even going to talk about areas. The thing that I remember more than anything was when we asked the patients for feedback, we were hoping that we'd get this overwhelming positivity about the service. Because it really was. It was a very intricate redesign. It moved hospital work into the community, but it brought the consultant with it. So the consultant and team were based in general practice alongside the GPs. And we were really excited about that, as working as a team. When we asked the patients for feedback, what the top feedback was there's a free car park because it's based in general practice. There's a bus stop right outside the practice, and actually there's a tram stop at the end of the road. So it's fantastic. It makes it much easier. It was none of the things that us as providers would have thought would have been important. It was all about ease of access and not having to turn up 2 hours early. I remember that. I don't have to go 2 hours early to find a parking space at the hospital anymore. And we often forget that from a patient perspective, as you've just cited, it's get in, get seen quickly, get fixed, and get back to life, are kind of the asks.
Keep repeating the same information to lots of different people. I think that's crucial, isn't it? But I mean, in terms of a more that's obviously a head in the clouds answer, and back in the real world, I think in terms of what I would change from a contracting perspective, I suppose I'd like to see a bit more consistency in approach between commissioners in different parts of the country. So I completely understand and think it's important that we have locally tailored services for local population needs, and the integrated care boards are in a far better position to do that than a national organisation. But I do, in my day-to-day work, come across quite marked variations between how different ICBs interpret the contract regulations, which aren't necessarily related to local needs. So, for example, if a practice wants to apply to incorporate its practice into a limited company, there's a mechanism and a policy and a procedure for that set out in the policy and guidance manual, but we still see hugely varying interpretations of that by different ICBs in different parts of the country, and that can make it very difficult for me as an advisor when I'm talking to clients about their options. It's quite hard for me to kind of say, well, this is what will happen, because we don't necessarily know, because different ICBs have different approaches. So I'd say that would be the thing from my day-to-day work that I would find.
That's a great answer, and it's one I recognise as well. There are times, in fact, I feel a little degree of empathy with the ICBs where they've inherited 3, 4, 5 CCGs now, particularly with the clusters, and we've got exactly the same services running in general practice, for argument's sake, but they're being paid 6 different amounts across the patch. You see that repeatedly. So I do have a real empathy with what the ICBs are inheriting. But so I would share your magic wand. Could we get a bit more consistency? Would be brilliant. Alison, thank you. I'm sure there are going to be people that are listening who might want an introduction to you, so they can always come back to me, and I'll be happy to do that. I can get people connected. If you have got questions or you've got things where you think Alison could help, I'll be delighted to do that. And I'm sure Alison would be delighted to speak to you as well. But I just wanted to say a massive thank you from me and from everybody that listens. I'm so grateful to you for your time. Thanks again for joining me, Alison.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks for inviting me. It's been
absolute
a pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you. If today's conversation has struck a chord, you'll love the Embedded Edge community. This is an online platform for people who want to stand out with better positioning and a deeper understanding of how decisions are really made inside the NHS. With practical frameworks, real-world analysis, and behind-the-scenes customer insights, you'll sharpen how you show up, engage, and embed your work. So please join Embedded Edge at www.scottmckenzie consultancy.com. Thank you.